right through centuries since the Industrial Revolution began. We as a planet, we as a species, humanity, we have destroyed so much of our planet. And we've done that because we had absolutely no idea of the systemic impact that we were having on planetary ecosystems and processes. Now we know, and we know because people have communicated it. The reason that I am passionate environmentalist and conservationist is not because I'm part of an academic elite. I am not. It's because when I was a kid, I saw people like David Attenborough, Jane Goodall, talking about our planet, talking about the natural world, and talking about what it is that we risk losing. The reason people care about that is because they know, and if you don't know about it, you don't care.
Well, a very good morning to you, Your Excellency Ambassador.
Selamat pagi, Professor Bagus.
Thank you so much for being here. Selamat pagi. I'm very excited to be talking to you. Kita akan bicara dalam dua bahasa, Indonesia dan Inggris, dan saya tahu Pak Dominic sangat-sangat bagus bahasa Indonesia.
Oh, terima kasih.
Seperti nama saya Bagus, gitu. I would like to introduce you first to the audience, and you are His Majesty's Ambassador to Indonesia and Timor-Leste, and you have been appointed by the British government in 2023. And you have held previous diplomatic positions, including ambassador to Afghanistan and to the United Arab Emirates. But the most interesting part is that you were once the director, if I'm not mistaken, of the Zoological Society of London. I've been to the zoo, right? And deep inside the zoo, I found Indonesian animals too, which is very fascinating. So yeah, I would like to congratulate you to be part of that institutions that really clearly have good impact on the environment, preserving animals from across the world. And today we're going to be talking a lot about environmental issues, sustainability, and the significance of the place we are now. So we are now in Ternate, and I would like to thank you again on behalf of the University of Nottingham for allowing us to partake in this trip. So we are in Ternate, and I would like to have you explain to the listeners about why we are here, who is Alfred Russel Wallace, and why is Maluku significant to the UK?
With great pleasure, and look, thank you for that introduction. I'm delighted to be part of this podcast today. I am here in Ternate at the invitation of the governor to come and celebrate the inauguration of a plaque, a commemoration of Alfred Russel Wallace. And Alfred Russel Wallace was a 19th century British person who came to the Malay archipelago. He wrote a very famous book called The Malay Archipelago, but it is what you and I would recognize today as Indonesia, Malaysia, and Borneo. And he, Brunei in fact, and he looked at the species that were here.
Yeah.
He worked with local experts from Ternate. He lived in Ternate at one point in Maluku Utara. And he looked at the species here, and he observed the way in which natural selection took place. And so the work that he and his now Indonesian collaborators did here had a massive impact on global thinking about the evolution of species. And he was a direct compatriot and collaborator with Charles Darwin. And so together, they evolved this theory of how humanity evolved and how species more generally evolved. And Bagus, you mentioned the Zoological Society of London.
Yes.
I'm delighted that it was a 200-year-old institution. It was set up in order to support zoological science, so completely evidence-based. And the reason that it has London Zoo and another zoo in it is in order to engage people on wildlife and habitats and how the natural world functions. And the reason for doing that is because we're losing it.
Yes,
and
we
so
are.
part of what I'm doing here at this commemoration at the invitation of the Indonesian local government is to talk about environment loss and to talk about the threat to not only the existence of the flora and fauna, the incredibly biodiverse flora and fauna of North Maluku, Ternate, and Indonesia, but the threat to you and me if our environment, if our habitat is destroyed.
Yeah.
And we are in danger of doing exactly that. And I'll just end with one piece of data.
Yeah.
So the Zoological Society of London does some amazing science on biodiversity and biodiversity loss. It does science that is used by many governments around the world and the United Nations. And it does a research called the Living Planet Index. Well worth looking this up. And the Living Planet Index looks at nearly 30,000 populations of animals around the world. Mm-hmm. And it has traced this in a scientifically evidenced manner since 1970. It is a good way of measuring population density, a good proxy for biodiversity loss around the world. And we've lost nearly 70% of our wildlife biodiversity on this planet since 1970. And that is an existential threat to the planet, but also to humanity.
I would say that people don't necessarily know how to draw the connection that you brought forward, for example, between why we're supposed to preserve these animals and what direct significance it has to our own existential problems, for example. And Wallace is also famous for putting forward this idea of Wallace line and emphasizing the significance of Indonesian flora and fauna and the biodiversity therein, right? But one other thing that people, I think in my generation and younger, I think arguably have little idea about is the significance of Wallace's work in Ternate and the conception of modern sciences, right? I think Indonesia is a place where some of these great sciences, some of them are Nobel-worthy, were first conducted in this land, right? And, you know, we have this idea about Indonesia being the home of modern earth science. I used to work at Imperial College London, and it was a great institution. It's a Royal School of Mines. It's, I think, along with some great institutions in the US, are world leading in earth sciences. But when it comes to volcanology, Indonesia is a place where there are high manifestations of geological processes, those with above 300 degrees of Celsius. The first time the naturalists come about knowing about these issues is in Indonesia as well. So my thesis to you is that Indonesia has to come strong with a new narrative at the global stage. Thanks to Wallace, for example, who shed light into the significance of Indonesian land and biology, Indonesia, I think, must be the world's new laboratory, a place where new sciences are discovered and where people come and seek answers and receive them. What do you think?
I think that's a great thesis. And I'm looking over your shoulder, Bagus, and we can see volcanoes around us as we speak. And these are volcanoes that Alfred Russel Wallace would have seen 160, 170 years ago. And Indonesia is as amazingly biodiverse and as stunning as a country, as a landscape now as it was then and has been for many thousands of years. And yesterday, you and I both visited one of the scree flows, the lava flows of a volcano in Ternate. And it was like a lunar landscape, wasn't it? Like something I've never seen anywhere else before. And so there is a uniqueness about Indonesia and what happens here. And I think that uniqueness is true of the geology, but also of the flora and the fauna. And you mentioned the Wallace line, and that is really cool. It's really extraordinary. It's this idea that Indonesia is where the animals, the flora and fauna of Australasia and the
Yes.
flora and fauna of Asia, they meet. And so you find, for example, tigers that you would only find in Asia, but then when you cross the Wallace line, you find, for example, marsupials, like the cuscus baramata biru, or a kangaroo that you only find in Australasia. And that is what makes Indonesia so special, that it is on the ring of fire geologically. It has this extraordinary meeting of two planetary features in flora and fauna. And so for Indonesians coming and looking at their own country and understanding that from a scientific perspective, it is just the most rich environment. And personally, I think you, as a representative of Nottingham University, we as the United Kingdom here and universities and researchers from the UK are really fortunate to be able to come and collaborate with Indonesian counterparts to take a look at this, because it is unique in the world.
Great. On this topic though, then what should we do? What can be done? I know that the UK has these tremendous programs like Newton Fund and others, which I personally have benefited from. It provides me the platform to collaborate with counterparts, fellow scientists in Indonesia. But what more can be done for that?
So I think there are a couple of things, Bagus, because first of all, I would like to see more academic collaborations and partnerships. And I think that government can play a role in supporting that. I'm thrilled that two world-class UK universities, Lancaster and KCL, are going to open up campuses here in Indonesia during this year. And they're doing that in partnership with institutions here in Indonesia. And part of the point of that will be to open up and this is at an undergraduate level, to open up the opportunity for early career Indonesians to receive a world-class education in their own country from a UK institution. And that's one example. But as I think about my profession and diplomacy, as I look at some of the challenges that we face as a planet, for example, on habitat loss, on pollution, on stopping further pandemics like the one we saw 3 or 4 years ago, we need, and we as the UK Foreign Office need, data and science on which to base discussions, negotiations, etc. And so we work with a lot of think tanks and universities to support that kind of science. Wouldn't it be great if Indonesia and the United Kingdom working together could work with universities and institutions in both countries to get an evidence base for the decisions we make in the international treaties, the partnerships that we do around the planet?
Great points. Now, a little bit for the leaders, the way we go about doing this conversation is by means of dialectics, by thesis and antithesis. And I think I owe it to the institutions that I have been so lucky to partake in the UK, this culture of talking in different perspectives. And so I want to put forward something to you that I would view as your thesis. And these are some of the points that you, I believe, are championing, right? And then you advocate for nature-based solutions as effective and cost-efficient methods for addressing climate change. This has been exemplified by both historical practices and current initiatives in the UK and in Indonesia. Now, the antithesis to me is this, and I tried to put forward this potential complexity of how things are potentially going to be put place in Indonesia. Now, regarding nature-based solutions, we have local way in doing things. You know, these are environmentally friendly. For example, in Bali, there's this practice called subak, right?
Yeah.
This is a local wisdom, tacit knowledge as to how people contend with nature and while at the same time doing productive activities like irrigations. And this has been proven, although not in complete laboratory setting, that has some resilience against pests and without using a heavy amount of pesticides. But I mean, these local wisdom, local practitioners can potentially be crippled by international regulations. The UK has high demands of palm oil, right? and so is other big countries. And this affects some deforestation practices in Indonesia and other countries like Brazil and Congo, actually. The new regulation that is going to be, or at least already now, put in place by the European government called the European Union Deforestation Regulation requires people, before they can even send goods outside Indonesia, to provide geolocation satellite-powered data to prove whether or not those products are subject to deforestation. Great initiatives. I think I can see that that's going to bring about changes positively in the world. However, these local farmers, these institutions, regional governments do not necessarily have the expertise, the knowledge as to how. I mean, I'm an earth scientist, so these are not trivial things. You know, we use remote sensings and others. And if they cannot be empowered to meet the standard, I'm afraid that we're going to encounter a not level playing field. So what can we do about that?
Well, you make a great point, Bagus, and that is that there are traditional ways, traditional knowledge here in Indonesia and frankly across the planet of how to resolve some of the issues that we've got.
Yeah.
I'm clearly, the UK is not a member of the European Union, and so I'm not going to comment on what our European friends have chosen to do. The way in which we approach, as the UK, we approach the sourcing of palm oil is to require importers and users of palm oil from anywhere on the planet to make sure that the laws of the country from which they're coming are fully observed. So we take an approach which is a legislation-based approach of the laws of the country. So we want to know that Indonesia's laws, because Indonesia sets its own standards and it understands how to empower its own producers, that Indonesia's laws are being respected. And it's critically important that that should happen. And the government of Indonesia is a real advocate. We've seen that the levels of deforestation in Indonesia over the last decade have dramatically reduced because the government recognizes the importance of Indonesia's natural flora and fauna, and that cannot be simply destroyed in order to create space for revenue-earning crops. And so there is a balance there, though, because there is a legitimate requirement, as I think you hinted at, a legitimate need for economic development. Everybody wants their kids to go to school and to face a bright future, and perhaps to be able to earn more money than they have done in the past. And this is a legitimate requirement. And so that search for sustainable solutions that allow economic development as well, or the two together, is incredibly powerful. And that's why, for example, as the United Kingdom and my own team in the British Embassy in Jakarta, we work across Indonesia with partners to look for those sustainable solutions that will allow revenue generation. And there is an enormous green industry growing across the planet and in this country, and you can do both at once. But Bagus, if I may, just a final point. You mentioned Bali's Subak system.
Yes.
And you began by talking about nature-based solutions. There is so much local and community and traditional knowledge in this country. And that is a real source of richness. One extraordinary nature-based solution that is incredibly biodiverse is the replantation of mangroves. Now, as an example, what do you do when you replant mangroves? And local people across Indonesia know this. You create a biosystem, you create an ecosystem that is rich in fish and other resources. It is fantastic for carbon sequestration and for
that's right.
For all sorts of planetary and environmental concerns. And it's also aiding communities in resilience against typhoons and other freak weather incidents. And so as a response to some of the planetary degradation that we see, the restoration of mangroves is just one really good example of a nature-based solution seen here in Indonesia.
And that's one of the reasons you mentioned, and I really appreciate the UK's approach in trying to put things in local perspective, right? You
Right.
try to understand Indonesian laws, and these are something that is not trivial, I think, and this is the reason why, as an institutions, we approach directly regional governments like West Java, West Nusa Tenggara, which have a very different set of problems and therefore different set of solutions too. We go there and then we try to boost knowledge exchange directly with them. This is something that I think, the devil is in the details. All right. Well, thank you very much. So another thing that you argue for is that successful climate action requires a synergy between political decisions and scientific evidence, right? Citing the historical significance of political leaders who have recognized and acted upon climate issues. Now, historical accounts is something somewhat problematic, and we know that the UK, the British, for example, for a brief period of time between the 1811 and 1816s were in Indonesia. And during time, actually before even that time, there is this little island called the Rune Island in the south of Maluku. At the time, it was very insignificant because it was very small. Nobody knows about that. But when the Dutch and the British knew about it, it was full with spices. Spices are great stuff because it makes things more flavorful, right? But it also...
It does. We have some extraordinary spices in front of us, and I'm drinking some spiced coffee from Ternate, which is just delicious.
Exactly, and it makes things last more, food lasts more, which is very significant for tropical countries like this, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I gotta say, this is the first time I see cloves that many. Very expensive in the UK too.
And the cinnamon as well. That's very good.
Yeah. But, how do we... that island has been subject of battles, right? People fight over it, and the Dutch, according to historical research that I read, upon claiming that island off of the British, they kill all the plants. They kill all the plants, making sure that that land is for nobody to want it anymore. So we have to deal with these historical accounts, and before we even integrate political decisions and scientific evidence, we have to deal with these problems too. So how do you think the British government could empower Indonesia with an historical account that has British involvement in it, in issues like Rune Islands, Ternate, and others?
Well, one of the amazing things about Indonesia is its real ownership of its own history and its own historical narrative. There is an enormous pride in Indonesia, for which I have great respect, of the impact that Indonesia has had over years since its Hari Kemerdekaan and since its Independence Day, of, for example, hosting the Bandung Conference, of being a founding member of the non-aligned movement, and having a foreign policy that is bebas dan aktif, so not aligned with any great power blocks or any one country or another, and that sense of ASEAN centrality. I think if I put all of that in the context that you're describing there, Bagus, then I see in Indonesia an acknowledgement, a respect for history and historical traditions that, yes, they go through Dutch colonial period and some really problematic incidents that happened throughout that period.
Yes.
And they go back through the Majapahit era, through the very formulation of the archipelago as the beginnings of what is now Indonesia, and that enormous diversity and richness of the traders who came to this country, who influenced it, many of whom stayed in this country, how Islam came originally to Indonesia. That Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, that sense of diversity that is at the heart of the Pancasila, that is integral to Indonesian identity. So for us as the UK, and for the way in which we have had a engagement and interaction with Indonesia over the centuries, but also now, what I think is admirable is that there is a recognition and ownership of that history, and that is part of what makes Indonesia the country it is today, and to look for points of connection. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I'm here at the invitation of the governor of North Maluku to celebrate some of what Alfred Russel Wallace and his Indonesian collaborators contributed to global science. That's an ownership and a recognition of that English gentleman's engagement here in Indonesia, but also how we did that with Indonesian people who enabled that to happen.
Yeah.
And I think that is a tremendous way to synthesize all these challenging, in some cases, elements of our combined histories.
Right. I've been lucky somewhat to join your entourage this couple of days. And
very welcome.
We understand that Wallace, during his time here, has great significance to the local communities. And there are about 6,000 or even more letters sent to and from him, and bring about knowledge of the local people and the local biodiversity to the outside world. Now, you mentioned about history, which is something that I think is very deep-rooted in identity. And history is a narrated past. And to be able to narrate things properly, you cannot just envelope everything on this issue of nationalism. You know, history that we are a big country, but you have to understand as a scientist the scientific significance of some historical accounts. We went to this rock formation that you spoke about earlier in this conversation. It's called Angus Rock Formations, right? It's a beautiful area, and it's all black. For example, take that as an example. So I'm part geologist. Rock formations, particularly around volcanic activities, are of andesitic nature. These are just some geological terms. Now, andesite, so in order to battle climate change, for example, one of the methods to do the mitigation is by means of carbon capture and storage, which the UK has great expertise in. Now, the storage bit is what Indonesia, I think, has a great potential in doing a lot more on the global stage. Now, that andesitic rocks is very ideal to be stored carbon dioxide within, particularly because when it reacts with supercritical carbon dioxide, it will become solid, or it will be solidified, and therefore increase the integrity of the storage site. By making it solid, you then prevent it from blowing up back to the surface. Okay. You know, people don't know about that. These are narratives of the historical past. And I think scientists have the tasks to unearth all of this significance. And I don't see them working in this dimension. They do not have the incentive, for example, to work with Indonesia exclusively, much less to bring the connection between this, like, say, carbon capture knowledge and the historical past of Indonesian geological processes, etc. What do you think we can do more to bring about this knowledge exchange activities more to the front?
Professor Bagus of Nottingham University, you're a scientist, you know Indonesia. I feel you're asking me a question that you've got a better answer to than I have. So what can we do? I think that we can celebrate the collaborations that there are already, and there are many collaborations between scientists in the UK and Indonesia. But I would absolutely love to see more. And I think we can look for ways in which to support those financially and to support those politically, where they can be part of that narrative, as I mentioned before, of where, for example, our governments are coming together to look for research on which to base data and on which to base evidence and action and policy. So I think that's something we can do as two countries. But I also think that there is an enormous role for private sector innovation here.
Oh, okay.
I love your mention of carbon sequestration through the use of geological formations. And as I look at some of the challenges that we face here in Indonesia, one of them is there's a real wish to use renewable energy for electricity generation. And that's critically important because at the moment, Indonesia is a net carbon emitter. And the Indonesian government is really committed to becoming a net carbon sink. And with the glorious forestry that Indonesia has, it should be a net carbon sink. And the reason that it isn't is because of the generation of electricity through coal in particular, but also a certain amount through diesel and other carbon fuels. So if you can use renewable energy, then that transforms that carbon output.
Yeah.
One of the challenges, though, is that where, for example, solar energy or wind energy would be most effective in Indonesia, is not where the requirements for the energy are. So you need the energy for people, and Indonesia's most populated part of the country is Java Island. You need the energy for heavy industry, for example, nickel smelting, and the other, what President Jokowi calls the hilirisasi of Indonesia's industrial sector. So transmission and storage of energy is critically important in this country. And that is a challenge to which innovation by scientists working in conjunction with commercial partners in both our countries could easily focus on that as a way of supporting science that delivers practical application and is then picked up and used by the commercial sector. And Bagus, you know that I have a personal family connection with Nottingham University. One of your colleagues is a relative of mine. And he and I have actually been working together on how to commercialize an energy storage solution that Nottingham University is working on. That is exactly the kind of scientific collaboration I would like to see more of here, that is practical, applied, and is going to deliver really important positive outcomes for people in Indonesia and people in the United Kingdom.
So will I see you in Nottingham a lot more, and try to convince our colleagues to come join this great initiatives?
Bersama kita bisa, Pak.
Bersama kita bisa. That's fascinating, Pak Dominic, if I may, because you mentioned about carbon sink. Indonesia is one of the largest natural carbon sink, peatlands. Right. Well, the UK has it as well at the north in Scotland, right? Peat bogs, but that is of very different nature. Indonesian peats are tropical, and we do research in my team. For example, we try to understand the variables that play into the dynamics of peatlands, and that can contribute to the evidence-based restoration strategy, and that's very complicated, and that's, I think, that has great significance to Indonesia. Now, on to my last point, you have another thesis. You underscore the necessity of public awareness and involvement in climate change. You reference influential communicators like Jane Goodall and David Attenborough. I live right next to the Attenborough National Park. Right. And I'm not sure if that national park is actually named after David Attenborough or not, but it's a place I really enjoy to get really close with the nature.
Okay.
You highlight the role of societal values and public opinion in driving political and environmental actions. I share that. Now, there is this so-called Minto stone, or in the local language, they call it Sangguran inscription, Prasasti Sangguran, right? And these are a set of 4-ton stones, couple of meters high, and it was erected in about 928 before Christ, in the month of August, on the 13th of August. And it has great significance to that place. That stone was first found in between Malang and Batu. The imitation of that stone at the time, today, has still been worshipped annually. The actual stone, though, 9 centuries after it was erected, has been in the Scottish border, right? So looking at the name Minto stones, it was first excavated by Colin Mackenzie and then brought forward to his superior, Raffles, and then eventually ended up in Minto State in Scotland. Now, that is of great scientific significance. For example, in order to battle climate change, you need to understand the relationship between humans and geological processes. Now, there are historical accounts in Indonesia where the change of powers, the structure of governments is heavily influenced by geological process. Now, for example, the change of the central of power from the central Javanese kingdom to the east is affected by, or may not be affected by, Gunung Berapi, the volcanic eruptions. Now, some of the key to understand that account is in that stone. So what I did was, a couple of months ago, almost a year ago, we gathered scientists to talk about it, to talk about it. Now, I have to be absolutely clear here. It does not belong to the UK government. It belongs to a private estate, right? But I think we have to shed more light into it. And not just to talk about blindly repatriating it, although I would, for one, champion repatriating it, but repatriating it so that we can study about it. So lithographers, philologists, and geologists even can talk about it, and therefore put Indonesia, during the first part of our discussion, we talk about new narrative that Indonesia is a place where anthropocenic dialogues, narratives are to be found. So this is contentious issues because people in Indonesia, the government agencies have been trying to repatriate it to no avail. What can we do about it?
Well, I think it's a really important point that you're making, which is about getting knowledge out that can be of benefit to society today. And as you say, Bagus, the Minto Stone is in the possession of a private individual. So as a representative of the UK government, I'm not going to comment on that. But very recently, the British Library did a massive project of digitization of all of Raffles' letters and many, many other items from Java, from his period here in the 1810s. And I presented a hard drive to the governor, His Majesty, the governor of Yogyakarta. And in the press conference that he and I did after that, he was asked by the media whether he wanted those letters from Raffles taken from the British Library to Java. And he said, "Blum."
Okay.
And the reason for that is because he knows that they are being properly looked after, properly curated at the moment. And the main point from his perspective is that all that data is now digitally available, globally available, online to researchers from Yogyakarta and from across the world. And that, I think, is absolutely the critical point that you're making, that there needs to be an open community of global scientists and researchers and public able to access these things. And why is this important? So you're describing something that may be in the domain, if you like, of academic elite to take an interest in that. And that has enormous value. But the reason that I am a passionate environmentalist and conservationist is not because I'm part of an academic elite. I am not. It's because when I was a kid, I saw people like David Attenborough, Jane Goodall, talking about our planet, talking about the natural world, and talking about what it is that we risk losing. And the reason why in the UK that people vote for policies that will support the halting of climate change and that will uphold the reduction in deforestation, that will try and stop biodiversity loss. The reason people care about that is because they know. And if you don't know about it, you don't care. Right through centuries since the Industrial Revolution began, we as a planet, we as a species, humanity, we have destroyed so much of our planet. And we've done that because we had absolutely no idea of the systemic impact that we were having on planetary ecosystems and processes. Now we know. And we know because people have communicated it. And you can have all the science in the world, but if that science is technical, then it will only have a limited impact. It will have an important impact on government policies, etc., if they are science-based policies, but it will be limited. And so the role of communicators, somebody like David Attenborough, people hero worship this 96-year-old man in the United Kingdom,
still going
elsewhere, because of the impact he's had in communicating. And that's why I think it's really great that you're doing this podcast and we're having these conversations. Because it gets a message out to people who can choose to ignore it if they wish, but at their peril.
I mean, to your credit, though, regarding the script by the Yogyakarta, for example, I mean, Sangguran inscription or the Minto stone is in good condition relative to the other one in other countries. And one can argue that it might have been better to credit the UK climate, for example. Probably it might have been better there than here. That's another matter. But
I don't know. I'm not going to make that thesis.
It's
Thank
wet,
you.
it's cold, but at some point it also might contribute to the preservation itself. But you mentioned about the roles of communicators. These are great, right? And we have narrators in Indonesia, mini David Attenborough, for example. And I think they have great potential to become not only narrators that bring people's attention to climate issues, but also as mini diplomats. I believe in this notion called science diplomacy or knowledge diplomacy. And I think I'm going to present to you my thesis. But before that, I want to ask you, what do you think success could look like as an ambassador? What are your aspirations? What do you want to achieve during your tenure here? Because my thesis is that, which you, I think, embody during our discussion, I established that ambassador and diplomacy in general requires science to be integrated in it. And then you, by coming to Ternate with us, shown that there is a great link between historical and scientific accounts of Wallace's work and diplomacy. And I think this is great things. So what does success look to you in general, and what would you like to achieve during your tenure here?
Oh, Pak Bagus. Saya mau menyelamatkan dunia.
Okay. You think we can do that?
So, yeah, I do.
Yeah.
Why am I here? Why do I do the job I do here in Indonesia? 3 reasons. One, I want to literally save the planet and to work with Indonesia on stopping biodiversity loss, stopping climate change. 2, I want to make a more prosperous world. And so I want to work with Indonesia, supporting trade and investment in both directions, because that is critical to the economic development of both our peoples. And 3, I want a peaceful world. And therefore, I work with Indonesia on really challenging geopolitics at the moment.
Right.
The context in which we're having this conversation is a difficult context in terms of some of the tragedies that are going on, some of the conflicts going on in the world, some of the impact that's having on ordinary people. And so planet, prosperity, and peace are the 3 things I want to achieve through my job here.
Pak Dominic, thank you very much for contending with these difficult questions with me. And thank you for your continual support in our engagement. And thank you for today.
An absolute pleasure, Bagus. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Thank you. Folks, that's Chronicles.